After the completion of the Raton Tunnel near the end of 1878, the first train passed through it on December 7th. The Santa Fe crew built the tracks past an old watering hole on the Santa Fe Trail known as Willow Springs, now Raton, New Mexico. And Raton, it's a relatively small town located on Interstate 25, where the majority of the town's history is rooted in mining and ranching. However, the city generally shifted its economics toward one focus on outdoor recreation while combating population decline. Both the Santa Fe Railroad and I-25 headed south on the sweet spot on the edge between the San Diego Cristo Mountains and the foothills. Heading southwest from Raton on Highway 64 is the small village of Cimarron, New Mexico. The population currently stands at 800 people. It primarily has a tourist and ranching-driven economy, along with a supporting retail section that serves the local community and tourists passing through the village. It is a textbook example of a mix of Old and New West, with how Cimarron blending the two economic spheres of these two worlds. But for those who don't know what the concept of the Old and New West, here's a breakdown. This narrative describes winning the West, or taming the vast open landscape, and all that is part of that landscape. It includes iconic cowboys living off the land, hardy souls digging for gold and other valuable minerals, and small group of individuals harvesting what the rugged landscape can provide. The narrative of the Old West is one of self-made pioneers and rural and small communities closely linked to industries dependent on resource extraction and commodification production, such as forestry, ranching, mining, and fisheries. The narrative of the New West is a portrait of a mix of rural and cosmopolitan, a prize outdoor recreation with blue-ribbon trout streams, world-renowned skiing, and miles of hiking and biking trails, of rapid urbanization and growth, of technology, and simplification of living off the land. This video will focus on the small village of Cimarron, New Mexico, how the Old West affected its industries in the first place, along with introducing the industries that were in the area and how it would affect Philmont Scout Ranch in the next episode with the rise of scouting tourism. For Cimarron, New Mexico, it is definitely invested in the notion of the Old West and the New West. The village tends to rely on scouts visiting Philmont Scout Ranch, or people heading up to Red River, New Mexico for fly fishing or skiing in the winter. I mentioned in my second video about the Santa Fe Trail on the layout of Cimarron, New Mexico, and how there are two distinct historic districts, Old Town and New Town. These are the results of transportation choices over the past 170 years, with the Old Town being directly part of Cimarron Santa Fe Trail, where the trail passed through the middle of it. In the early 1900s, the railroad company arrived in Cimarron, shifting the village economic center to what is now known as New Town, as evident by the buildings in downtown Cimarron. Compared to Old Town, New Town has a much more modern Western town look, familiar to many of us from our travels throughout the American West. Another essential aspect visible from above is the town's layout. The grid layout is all too familiar to people who played the video game Cities Skyline, particularly when you're placing commercial zoning close to a major roadway such as Highway 64, and further from the town center in the hills is the local housing. The grid layout now benefits from the railroad passing through the village, but it was laid out when Cimarron had a railroad with a significant land sale company that sold plots in the new town of Cimarron. The railroad did not invent the grid, but merely imported it from the east, then set it down everywhere they went, posing Cartesian order on an unruly landscape. The grid dictated that broad avenues marched like a military parade straight through the town, with narrow streets regularly crossing them at exact right angles. Foreign as that geometrical concept might have been to the untrampled West, where people have always set their crude houses down in loose, disorderly clumps. It was the standard feature of every railroad town past the Mississippi. In Cimarron, New Mexico, we can see another example from the first decade of the 20th century. George Whimsey, Fred Whitley, and Charles Springer founded the Cimarron Town Site Company, whose sole purpose was to sell land within the Cimarron town limits, aiming to develop it into a bustling town that could rival Raton and Dawson in the early 20th century. The Cimarron Town Site Company also had a newspaper that was party association with it, the Cimarron Citizen, which would run advertisement for it. Most of my primary sources for this video will be found on Chronicling the America website, which is part of the Library of Congress. And it is a fantastic resource for any historian, but I have issues with the website interface, and sometimes it does not have a specific issue saved for one of the newspapers above. I wanted to use newspapers as a primary source for this video, but there are issues with that, since the best approach for this video would be to use primary sources from the area alongside secondary sources. Newspapers are often biased against specific individuals and has been used as tools by different political parties in many major cities. Still, there are significant advantages to using newspapers as a primary source for researching local businesses, which are an integral part of local history, as they offer a valuable perspective on the past. I would like to bring up a quote from my textbook that says from Craft of History class. Jesus, that was 8 years ago. The textbook Doing History, an Introduction to the Historian's Craft, described the use as newspapers as being, some scholars do not consider these true primary sources, but a glimpse at the citations in respected history journals indicated how often they are used. This quote gave us a better idea how to approach and use these often biased primary sources for historic research, since we are often relying on the writings of journalists who have their own agenda, one that they and the owners of the paper share. Remy, Springer, and Whitney, their goals with the newspaper was to give enough eyeballs to justify a feature here in Cimarron. Their newspapers wasn't the only ones that came about with the arrival of railroad companies in the village of Cimarron, as evident in the local newspapers during the 1900s. In the early 20th century, the town had about 200 newspapers along with the Cimarron Citizen, Cimarron News and Press, and Cimarron News. These three were already spreading the word about how well Cimarron is doing during this decade, and the free newspapers were particularly interested in attracting more people to the community to justify the land sales company's purchase of additional ad space. The newspaper published an editorial and advertisements about why this land was best for farming, mining, and timber harvesting, and served as the key advertising platform for local land sale companies. These land sale companies listed above were actively seeking to sell land in the village of Cimarron to develop it or the surrounding countryside where individuals can establish new lives in the hills and mountains of New Mexico. Cimarron was a railroad in the area during the turn of the century, helped develop industries that depended on extraction of natural resources in the mountains and canyons surrounding the village. Right now, of all four of the industries that have been around for most of Cimarron's history, only one remains. The four industries that were slowly gaining momentum were stunted in the early 20th century due to the area's lack of railroads, were lumber, mining, ranching, and farming. Lawrence R. Murphy, who wrote in his book Philmont, A History of New Mexico Cimarron Country, about how the residents wanted to get a railroad in this part of the region so their community can survive and wouldn't be one of those worthless communities which are already cluttered the West. That same paragraph details the need that these Old West industries needed to succeed if they had a robust transportation system in the region that could ship it out. 2 years before the newspapers I'm using, the construction began on the St. Louis, Rocky Mountain, and Pacific Railway Company, main line from Raton to Cimarron. And during the early 20th century, journalists wrote about how the St. Louis, let's just say the St. Louis, needed 2 more very important things to operate and extend its rail network: lumber and coal. And luckily for them, but this region had plenty of these 2 resources to offer.